He is a fascist, a Nazi, literally Hitler. Anyone here who has had the displeasure of watching enough leftist content online knows these phrases all too well. Most of the time, they use these terms in reference to people like Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, George Bush, Jordan Peterson, Steven Crowder, and even Ben Shapiro, along with countless others. Now, whether or not you agree with these people or not, you can't deny the fact that the term fascist and Nazi has been used so much by the left that it has lost all meaning. And I'm not the only one with this revelation. In a debate panel featuring Vaush and Destiny, along with a dozen or so leftist content creators, they all debate on the question of fascism, what it means, and whether or not certain people they don't like fit such a definition. There were about 16 people or so on that panel, and by the end of the panel, there are about 16 different definitions of fascism. Vaush described it as anti-democratic, and started regurgitating a leftist conspiracy that Bush had stolen the 2004 election to prove Bush as a fascist. Destiny described it as everyone is against you and only I can help you type of messaging. Another described it as having an unconditionally supportive voter base. Another described it as the desire to purify one's nation. By the end, no one had a clear definition. The debate panel is one of the least productive, cringy debates I've ever seen on BreadTube. Destiny himself stated that he would never call someone a fascist, or some policy a fascist. As to him, the term has lost all meaning. George Orwell himself made this observation way back in 1944, while World War II was still happening. He writes in his 1944 essay entitled, "What is Fascism?" It will be seen that, as used, the word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. In conversation, of course, it is used even more widely than in print. I've used it applied to farmers, shoekeepers, social credit, corporal punishment, Foxendy, bullfighting, the 1922 committee, the 1941 committee, Kipling, Gandhi, Kai-shek, Keck, homosexuality, Priestley's broadcast, youth hostels, astrology, women, dogs, and I do not know what else. But fascism is also a political and economic system. Why, then, can we not have a clear and generally accepted definition of it? Alas, we shall not get one. Not yet, anyway. To say why would take too long, but basically it is because it is impossible to define fascism satisfactorily without making admissions with neither the fascists themselves, nor the conservatives, nor socialists of any color are willing to make. All one can do for the moment is use the word with a certain amount of circumspection and not, as it is usually done, degrade it to the level of a swear word. The reason why I bring all this up is to demonstrate that we Americans have absolutely no idea what fascism is. So little of us do, that if you walked up to someone on the street and asked them to define fascism for you, 99.5% would likely fall flat on their face. We have so little understanding of what fascism is that we define fascism as being on the extreme right, with communism on the extreme left. However, Benito Mussolini himself was a devout anarcho-syndicalist in the beginning of his life. Furthermore, Giovanni Gentile derived his fascist thought from Hegelian dialectics, something that also inspired Karl Marx when he was deriving his ideology of communism. Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, was originally a member of the Labour Party. Most of us don't know the full name of the party that Hitler belonged to, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. We'll individually dive into each of these figures and their relation to leftism later. But the fact of the matter is that nearly every single major fascist figure and fascist movement in the 20th century were originally derived from leftism, or part of a leftist movement. Most of us are unaware of this fact, and those who are aware of it shoo it away as right-wing propaganda. Progressives' constant use of the term fascist to describe anyone on the right is either lazy ad hominems or dishonest projection. But if you don't believe me, let's look into it. Giovanni Gentile was the father of fascism. In 1917, he became professor of history and philosophy at the University of Rome. There, he began to shape and form his ideology of fascism. However, as most fascists in history, he had his ideological roots in Marxism. One of Gentile's first works at the University of Rome was in 1899, La Filosofia de Marx, or The Philosophy of Marx, where he examined Karl Marx's philosophy from a Hegelian perspective. Gentile was an avid reader of Marx, and his writings surely influenced his beliefs. Furthermore, Gentile's ideology was based heavily on Hegelian thought. Benedetto Croce wrote that Gentile holds the honor of having been the most rigorous neo-Hegelian in the entire history of Western philosophy. Why is this important? Well, because Hegel was also one of the leading influences to Karl Marx's writings as well. This one is more accepted by leftists, but just to demonstrate, Hegel is literally the second link on the Wikipedia page of influences of Karl Marx. Furthermore, his ideology of fascism had created the foundation of something known as legal naturalism. Legal naturalism was a term coined by philosophers to describe a phenomena in the social philosophy of Karl Marx, which can be interpreted as one of natural law. It is the manifestation of natural law in a Marxist context. As one writer put it, legal naturalism is, ultimately, a synthesis of the Marxist theory with the natural law theory. Or to put it in English, legal naturalism was a fascist theory that has ideological roots in Marxism. In summary, Marxism was a branch off of Hegelian thought, and Gentile founded his belief on this Hegelian branch. He also had excessively studied Marxist thought, and it heavily influenced his beliefs. He also laid the groundwork for a large part of modern Marxist theory. Fascism's ties to Marxism are clear. What's even stronger is his ties to syndicalism, which is another far-left economic ideology. From Gentile's Origins and Doctrine of Fascism. As opposed to standard socialism, the proletariat found in syndicalism a faith in a moral reality exquisitely ideal or mythic, for which one would be prepared to live, die, and sacrifice oneself, even to the point of using violence whenever violence was necessary to destroy and establish order to create another. Fascism accepted from syndicalism the idea of the educative and moral function of the syndicate, but since the intention was to overcome the antithesis between the state and the syndicate, the effort was made to enter the system of syndicates harmoniously into corporations subject to discipline by the state, and thereby give expression to the organic character of the state. Oh, and if you don't know what any of that meant, don't worry, we'll talk about that later and you'll understand by the end of the video. The ties to syndicalism go deeper than this. We'll cover that in our Mussolini section. One of the most common reflections on this is that fascism is itself socialism based on a national identity, or syndicism implemented on a national scale. It's no wonder why Gentile went so far as to declare fascism is a form of socialism. In fact, it is its most viable form.
Kundgebungen, mit denen ich empfangen worden bin, haben mich tief bewegt.
If Giovanni was the songwriter and producer of fascism, Mussolini was its frontman. But his past is even more interesting. For years, Mussolini wrote for a left-wing newspaper, the Avanti, or Forward in English. The newspaper was the official voice of the Italian Socialist Party at the time. He was one of its most well-regarded journalists at the socialist paper. At the age of 29, Mussolini managed to become one of the most effective and widely read socialist journalists in Europe. Later, in 1912, Mussolini joined the leaning leftist party in Italy at the time, the Italian Socialist Party, of which he was an outspoken member of. In 1912, he was also elected as the head of the Italian Socialist Party of Congress of Reggio Emilia. During World War I, Mussolini wrote, "With the unleashing of a mighty clash of peoples, the bourgeoisie is playing its last card and calls forth on the world scene of which Karl Marx called the sixth great power, the Socialist Revolution." He only left the party after voicing his support for the Italian intervention in World War I, a war which the majority of the party called the Bourgeois War. Mussolini then went on to favor national syndicalism, an ideology which we'll delve into later. In fact, Mussolini wasn't the only leftist in the party to turn to national syndicalism after World War I. World War I tore the party apart. The Orthodox Socialists were challenged by advocates of national syndicalism, who called for revolutionary war to liberate Italian-speaking territories, and force the government by threat of violence to create a corporatist state. The National Syndicalists intended to support Italian republics in overthrowing the monarchy if such reforms were not made and if Italy did not enter the war together with the Allied powers. The dominant internationalist and pacifist wing of the party remained committed to avoiding what it called a bourgeois war. The PSI, or Italian Socialist Party's refusal to support the war led to its national syndicalist faction either leaving or being purged from the party, such as Mussolini, who began to show sympathy to the National Socialist cause. Clearly, the National Syndicalist movement, which would later become the fascist movement, was originally an outspoken wing of the Italian Socialist Party. If you need more proof that National Syndicalism originated from fascism, here you go. Syndicalist Georges Sorel began to increasingly advocate a more focus on direct action to advance socialist ideals. As Marxism went through a reformist phase, this syndicalist alternative gained support. In 1900, French syndicalist Georges Maurras declared in Action Franciscaise newspaper that anti-democratic socialism is the pure and correct form of socialism. From then on, he and other members of Action Franciscaise hoped to form a collaboration with revolutionary syndicalists. Such collaboration was formed in 1908 with a group of labor unions led by Émile Gentile. As a result of this collaboration, Gentile founded the anti-republican journal Terre Libre. Georges Sorel played a role in shaping the views of Benito Mussolini and by extension, the wider Italian fascist movement, which retained the syndicalist belief in direct action by organization to advance the socialist agenda. In March 21, Sorel wrote that Mussolini was a man no less extraordinary than Lenin himself. If you're not convinced, fine. Let's look at the ideology of corporatism, the fascist economic policy, more closely. Corporatism, or national-syndicalism, was, as the name suggests, simply syndicalism implemented on a national scale. Syndicalism was the use of trade unions to achieve class liberation for the working class. These unions would work as syndicates to achieve higher wages, better working conditions, and soon, class liberation. What made syndicalism so attractive to many Marxists at the time was the fact that each union was made up not of party, but of class. Also, each union was seen as embracing pure action. Émile Gentile said, "What sets syndicalism apart from various schools of socialism and makes it superior is its doctrinal sobriety. Inside the unions, there is little philosophizing. They do better than that. They act." This unification and action was transferred over to national syndicalism. As Mussolini put in the doctrine of fascism, "The only doctrine I had practical experience with that of socialism from until the winter of 1914, nearly a decade. My experience was that of both a follower and a leader, but it was not a doctrinal experience. My doctrine during that period had been the doctrine of action." Fascism was not the nursling of a doctrine previously drafted at a desk. It was born out of the need of action, and was action. It was not a party, but in the first 2 years, an anti-party and a movement. The existing forms of political representation cannot satisfy us. We want direct representation of the several interests. It may be objected this program implies a return to the guilds. No matter. I therefore hope this assembly will accept the economic claims advanced by national syndicalism. It was this last quote that best demonstrates the fascist ties to the ideals of syndicalism. Mussolini believes that all aspects of economic life in a nation, from the workers, to the farmers, to laborers, to the craftsmen, to the capital owners, to the soldiers, should form corporations, in which they all work together to further a common cause. Cause that coincides with the interests of the state. As Mario Parlamari put in his philosophy of fascism, individualism can only stress the claims of the individual to complete self-expression and make of these claims the highest goal and the true end of life. The claims of one individual must need conflict with the claims of another. The life of one being must needs be at war with the life of the whole if those claims are to be triumph. An effort must be made to break the invisible tide which binds together the destinies of all men, if the life of the one be set against the life of another. A whole endless series of evil arises in short whenever and wherever individualism triumphs as a philosophy and a way of life. In other words, under individualistic competitive capitalism, a shoemaker acts financially to put his fellow citizen or his fellow shoemaker out of business. He works in order to make sure that his fellow craftsmen starve. Now, this is wrong on multiple levels, but I didn't make this video to debunk fascism, I made it to explain fascism and leftism. British historian Paul Johnson explained Mussolini's economic beliefs like this. Mussolini now wanted to use and exploit capitalism rather than destroy it, but his was to be a radical revolution nonetheless, rooted in a pre-war, vanguard elite Marxism and syndicalism, which was to remain to his death the most important single element in his politics. So, under corporatism, or fascist economic policy, the model of a worker union acting for the goal of class liberation is scaled up to include unions of farmers, workers, business owners, and such that act not for class liberation, but in order to achieve the interests of the state. Under corporatism, the diverging interests of these corporations are harmonized and unified. These interests are to be guided for, say, educating a society, getting out of depression, stopping unemployment, or even fighting a war. Let's look at that quote from earlier. Fascism accepted from syndicalism the idea of the educative and moral function of the syndicate, but since the intention was to overcome the antithesis between the state and the syndicate, the effort was made to enter the system of syndicates harmoniously, and of corporations subject to discipline by the state to thereby give expression to the organic character of the state. Furthermore, in the doctrine of fascism, no individuals or groups outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, in which unity within the state is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but class struggle. Fascism is likewise opposed to trade unionism as a class weapon. But when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or cooperative system in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. Grouped according to their several interests, individuals form classes. They form trade unions when organized according to their several economic activities. But first and foremost, they form the state, which is no merely matter the numbers, the sons of the individuals forming the majority. This is where the common misconception among the left arises. They claim that Mussolini hated trade unions and directly ordered the black shirts to assault said unions, and he would later go on to crush strikes and suppress unauthorized labor unions. They claim that, because of this, Mussolini hated the working class. It's actually quite the opposite. Mussolini hated these particular unions not because he hated workers' rights, but because he saw them as pushing on an interest that crossed against the interests of the state. An example is seen in Mussolini's hatred and then later open arms acceptance of worker cooperatives. Italian fascists were initially hostile to the cooperative movement, which emanated from the socialist and communist-controlled factory council movement of the post-World War I period. Fascist bands terrorized, sacked, and burned co-ops in the early 1920s. In 1922, the cooperative movement organized as the Liga Nazionale de Cooperative del Monte sought official recognition from Mussolini, who granted it on the condition that the Leghe purged socialists and communists. It did, and from then on, cooperatives flourished under Mussolini's rule. However, after Mussolini was fully in power, the threat of worker co-ops intersecting with the interests of the state were far less. In fact, he would later embrace them. Ideologically, the Italian cooperatists benefited fascist propaganda. Mussolini pointed to them as the ideals of corporatism. They embodied worker participation, non-conflictual relations between labor and management, and the withering away of class identifications. Large corporations, despite the imposition of vertical, cross-class syndicates, could not bear the entire propagandistic burden of the ideal because structural hierarchies and status differences in the factories were too great in managing their large work. Valery J. Tishenko, a socialist, put it as such. The Italian fascism did not intend to destroy cooperation as such, but wanted to subordinate cooperatives to the state, and refused to recognize a cooperative movement may have other aims than to serve the state. Fascists were rather liberal regarding the rural organizations. They were, however, definitely against consumer cooperatives, considering them nests of socialists. On November 13th, 1922, Mussolini declared, "All my sympathy is with those forms of cooperation which, conscious of their high social mission and holding themselves above the passions of politics and religion, act as an army of defense against the greed of speculation. Cooperation is a matter of high social value and, as such, can ask of the state not financial privileges, but moral support in such direction as will ensure its exercises in an atmosphere of freedom." In 1922, a temporary Central Commission of Cooperatives was organized by the fascists. It was composed of 10 representatives of cooperation and 9 of the government. It was entrusted with the task of recognizing and coordinating the whole cooperative movement in 1924. The Grand Fascist Council passed a resolution approving the recognition and unification of the movement. Simply put, Mussolini supported the model of a worker co-op. In fact, he pointed to it as an exemplary example of his fascist view of economics, in addition to his support of unions and as such. However, when it was the case that these organizations crossed paths with the state, like harboring people who were hostile to the ideals of nationalism, or hampering production for a certain goal or quota, Mussolini came down with an iron fist. He supported these working class organizations as long as they didn't interfere with his nationalist views. Remember, national-syndicalism. And while that may seem like a really big qualifier, keep in mind that it was the exact same case with private businesses and private trade. Fascists controlled these sectors of society indirectly through threats of violence, having one's factory entirely taken over by the state. They were technically run privately, but these countless fascist inspectors and regulators to make sure the company was in line really made it so that it wasn't. This is one of the worst contradictions of fascism I noticed. The idea that you are free to do what you wish as long as your choices don't interject with the interests of the state, That seems pretty Orwellian to me. But if that's not enough to convince you, if all of that evidence didn't convince you of the close ties between fascism and socialism, let's look at the words of Mussolini himself. Do not believe, even for a moment, that by stripping me of my membership card of the Italian Socialist Party, you do the same to my socialist beliefs, nor that you would restrain me of continuing to work in favor of socialism and of the revolution. Some still ask of us, what do you want? We answer with 3 words that sum up our entire program. Here they are: Italy, Republic, Socialization. Socialization is no other than the implementation of Italian socialism. Here's what Mario Palomari wrote in his 1936 book, The Philosophy of Fascism, in regards to capitalism. Finally, when we remember that the whole history of the Italian culture is not a history of mass expression and mass achievement, but the history of the personal, highly individualized, and highly characteristic contribution of each single Italian, the cumulative effort required by the creation of such a culture, we can look, which but dismay, at the imposition of capitalism upon the economic life of the Italian people. The success of capitalism is based upon the subjection of a whole class of people to a standardization of personal work, subjection of the whole nation to a standardization of national taste, subjection of each national state itself to a common international standardization of life. Capitalism, in other words, apart from all numerous evils entrained in its wake, as experienced by all Western nations alike, represents for Italy the antithesis and a nemesis of that aspect of her true national spirit reflected in the economic life of her people. That literally sounds like it was ripped straight from the words of Das Kapital. And if I didn't tell you that it was from Mario Palomari, you would have never guessed that it came out of the mouth of a fascist. It's no wonder why French historian Franciscus Furet wrote that communism and fascism grew up on the same soil, the soil of Italian socialism.
Ladies and gentlemen, this great meeting is gathered here tonight to hear the policy and fate of fascism. If you think the present...
If Gentile was the songwriter and producer, and Mussolini the frontman, Oswald Mosley was likely the bass player who even the die-hard fans forget exists sometimes. This is due to the fact that, despite being the leading fascist politician of Britain for decades, his fascist movement never got off the ground in the way that Mussolini's did. Nonetheless, leftist roots are seen in Oswald Mosley as well. Oswald Mosley was one of the youngest members of Parliament at the time, represented Harrow, a British province, from 1918 to 1924 before starting the British Union of Fascists. During his time in Parliament, Mosley was originally a conservative. However, it must be noted that his initial joining of the party was not ideological. Although he was a member of the Conservative Party, his personal politics had little to do with the party. In his autobiography, My Life, Mosley claims that he was going into the House of Commons as one of the representatives of the war generation for that purpose alone. After many ideological disagreements, and being disenfranchised by their capitalistic attitudes, Mosley left the conservative movement to act as an independent in 1922. By 1924, Oswald Mosley was increasingly attracted to the Labour Party and their platform. For context, we Americans tend to think of the Labour Party as equivalent to the modern-day Democratic Party. In actuality, the British Labour Party is far more openly socialist than even most American Democratic politicians. This was especially the case in the 1920s and 1930s, when the Labour Party was openly embracing socialist ideals, and many of them dog-whistling support for the Soviet Union. Mosley had joined this party in March of 1924, and also immediately joined the Independent Labour Party. By this time, Oswald Mosley had very openly allied himself with the left. Due to the fact that he would likely lose re-election in his district as a member of the Labour Party, Mosley campaigned directly against Neville Chamberlain in the district of Birmingham. While campaigning, Mosley had accused Chamberlain of being a, quote, landlord's hireling, and only lost by 77 votes. While outside of Parliament, Mosley had been conducting work and developing proposals for the Labour Party. Mosley was re-elected to Parliament in 1926. While in Parliament, he was appointed as the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster in 1929, making him a prime minister of Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government. Here, Mosley demonstrates how fascism in Britain was born out of socialism. His proposals to solve the unemployment crisis were blocked, as they were seen as too radical for both the Labour majority cabinet and Mosley's superior, James Henry Thomas, a famous trade unionist and Labour politician. The trade that broke the camel's back was when he proposed what he dubbed the Mosley Memorandum. After the 1929 Depression, Mosley sought out radical socialist proposals to solve it. He laid out his scheme to get Britain out of the Depression. The memorandum contained plans for state nationalization of industries, public works programs to solve unemployment, and a general foundation for the fascist corporate state. At the time, British economic policy relied heavily on Smithian free market principles. It was this deep-seated belief that contributed the most to rejection of Mosley Memorandum by Parliament. Britain's previous success with an export-driven economy led to near religious zeal for free trade principles among the government. However, Mosley believed that this changing world market rendered the traditional basis of Britain's island trade obsolete. Mosley also hoped to assuage unemployment through a significant government works programs initiative. Over 3 years, Mosley proposed the allocation of £200 million to the purpose of creating government-sponsored jobs for the unemployed. Among these jobs was a mobile labor corps intended to provide more immediate aid helping refurbish urban slums. Mosley hoped to use deficit spending to help curtail unemployment and boost morale in concrete and visible measures such as urban renewal. His ideals for a sweeping reform of the foundation of British economics seemed an overreaction. The official committee appointed to evaluate the memorandum exemplified this attitude. Led by Chancellor Philip Snowden, the committee rejected the memorandum in its entirety. Because of what he saw as both political parties favoring laissez-faire attitudes, Mosley, in May 1930, resigned. The socialist British newspaper at the time published this in regards to Mosley's resignation. The resignation of Sir Oswald Mosley is an event of capital importance in domestic politics. We feel that Sir Oswald Mosley has acted rightly, as he has acted courageously, in declining to share any longer in responsibility for inertia. Once more in October, he attempted to convince the Labour Party conference to accept this memorandum again, but failed. Mosley's ideas on economics were similar to the ideals of the famous theorist John Maynard Keynes. In fact, Mosley remained in close contact with Keynes throughout his time with the Labour Party. Mosley and Keynes met often to discuss their ideals on the economic crisis. However, the extent of Mosley's ideals predated even Keynes himself. Keynes did not advocate Mosley's level of deficit spending until 1936. Mosley's economic proposals were truly, quote-unquote, ahead of his time, and represented a radical departure from contemporary economic orthodoxy. To combat unemployment and to deal with the economic crisis in general, Mosley believed that political power needed to be more centralized. He argued for the creation of a new cabinet, led by the Prime Minister and other top MPs, which was to be advised by a think tank of economic experts. This cabinet was to utilize all of the resources of the nation to fight the economic disaster. After resigning from the Labour Party, Mosley formed the New Party. He and several other Labour politicians, who had also resigned after Mosley's memorandum failed to pass, formed it with him. In the Times magazine, Mosley stated that the New Party's intent was to, quote, challenge the 50-year-old system of free trade which exposes industry in the home market to the chaos of world conditions, such as price fluctuation, dumping, and the competition of sweated labor, which, itself, is the lowering of wages and industrial decay. Mosley's formation of the New Party had a spoiler effect, causing several conservatives to win the election. This was due to the fact that the New Party had split the vote of the Labour Party. Following the death of Labour MP Albert Bellamy in March, the New Party stood for election in the constituency alongside Labour and Conservative candidates. The New Party candidate, Alan Young, received 4,000 votes to Labour's 11,000 and Conservatives' 12,000. The Conservative victory in the election led to serious Labour bitterness towards Mosley for a perceived splitting of the Labour vote. Following the declaration of the results, an angry mob formed outside the town hall. They shouted at Mosley, calling him a traitor and Judas. The son of the defeated Labour candidate charged the steps and accused Mosley with ruining his father's chances. In response, Mosley turned to John Strachey and said, "That is the crowd that has prevented anyone doing anything in England since the war." The New Party did relatively well in the 1931 election. However, by October of the same year, the general election only saw the New Party winning 0.2% of the vote. It was this outcome that caused Mosley to abandon the New Party and form the British Union of Fascists. Furthermore, John Strachey, who who had worked closely with Mosley while in the Socialist New Party. After abandoning the New Party, John Strachey, unlike Mosley, didn't turn to fascism. Instead, he turned to communism. Outside of established politics, fascism was not the only alternative ideology. John Strachey, Mosley's compatriot in the New Party and a primary contributor to the New Party's economic program, moved seamlessly towards communism following his break with Mosley in July 1931. Now, Mosley, like Hitler and Mussolini, loathed communism. But just like Mussolini and Hitler, Mussolini hated communism out of its anti-nationalistic elements and not its economic elements. While he strongly advocated for a corporate state, he rejected the essential Marxist tenet of class conflict. He believed class conflict led only to violent revolution. He could not accept communism's reliance on economic and societal collapse as catalyst for change. In his autobiography, My Life, Mosley described communism as a party which aims not at the reform, but at the overthrow of society. The communists are also possessed by the belief that the ends justify the means to a far greater extent than any other practitioners of the pernicious and socially disruptive doctrine. Dedicated communists are highly trained political soldiers, equally prepared to sing in the choir of churches open to their infiltration, or to use machine guns in the streets which are conveniently carried beneath surplices. John Oswald Mosley's fascism came out of his socialism, something that is clear from every single aspect of his time in Parliament and in British politics. But he's not the only one. The many fascist movements in France saw similar examples. Now, there were a lot of fascist movements in France during the interwar period, so I won't have time to cover them all in great depth, so let's do a speed run. George Valois, similar to Benito Mussolini, was a devout anarcho-syndicalist. However, he would later split from the movement and reformed the Cercle Proudhon in 1912, a national syndicalist political group. For context, Mussolini only formed his fascist party in 1921, so this group was very new. The group's inspiration came not only from George Sorel, a Marxist and a syndicalist, Charles Maurras, but also from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. The group's name is derived. Pierre Proudhon was born in 1809 and was one of the most famous socialist philosophers of all time. His thought is what developed the mutualist philosophy. In fact, he was the first philosopher to declare himself an anarchist. He is considered to be the father of anarchism. It was his writings that influenced George Valois and the Cercle Proudhon. Here's what the Cercle Proudhon's stated declaration is. The founders, Republicans, Federalists, Integral Nationalists, and Syndicalists, having resolved the political problem or dismayed it from their minds, are all enthusiastically in favor of an organization of French society in accordance with the principles taken from the French tradition which they find in Proudhon's works and the contemporary syndicalist movement. Democracy is the greatest error in the past century. While Cercle Proudhon was very small, it was the first movement of its kind in France, while many of its members would go on to play large parts in later fascist movements. In fact, George Valois would go on to found the Les Fachés party in 1925, which would gain far more prominence. Valois' brand of fascism was shown in his party. Here, Valois considered fascism to be a revolt against bourgeois rule, and as such, it had much more in common with Marxism. He described them as brother enemies. He stated that fascism had exactly the same object of socialism, even if he viewed the latter as flawed in its means of achieving that end. These fascist movements are further evidence of the ideological pipeline between fascism and leftism. George Sorel, as previously mentioned, was a Marxist and later a syndicalist. He had carefully studied the writings of Marx and Engels and had wrote many articles praising Lenin and the Russian Revolution, while still giving token denouncements of their authoritarianism. By 1922, however, he had openly came out in favor of Lenin and Bolshevism in 1922. During the interwar period, he, and during the later years of his life, had later embraced fascism. According to Jean Doriot, in March 1921, Sorel told him that Mussolini is a man no less extraordinary than Lenin. He too is a political genius, of a greater reach than all of the statesmen of the day, with the only exception of Lenin. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, Boulez had heavily influenced the Cercle Proudhon's views. The Neo-socialists, you literally can't get more obvious than that, was a fascist movement in France in the 1930s that heavily collaborated with Vichy France when it was established. It was founded by Marcel Diet, who was a member of the French section of the Workers' International, and also by Pierre Renduel, who was the founder of the Socialist Party of France. a national leader of the French International and a founder of the socialist newspaper La Vie Socialiste. They advocated for authoritarianism, anti-Semitism, and collaborated with the National Socialists in Germany. They were originally a part of the French section of the Workers' International, which was, as the name suggests, the designated party for the workers, or just the designated Socialist Party of France. Similar to Italian fascism, the Neo-socialists split off from the party due to differences in the embrace of nationalism and because of rejection of revolutionist Marxism and reformist socialism. Instead, they advocated revolution from above, which saw them trying to use the government in order to achieve socialism. Jacques Doriot, in 1916, during World War I, became a devout socialist. In 1920, he joined the French Communist Party. Soon, Jacques became a leading member of the party. In 1922, he became a member of the President of the Executive Committee of the Comintern. And a year later, he was made secretary of the French Federation of Young Communists. After being elected as the mayor of Saint-Denis in 1931, Doriot began to advocate for a popular front, or an alliance between communists and socialists. It was this reason Doriot was kicked out of his Communist Party. From there, Jacques Doriot would turn to fascism as an alternative to channel his beliefs. In 1936, he founded the French Popular Front, which was the largest fascist movement in France at the time. It had advocated for anti-Semitism, anti-Freemasonry, authoritarianism, and a fascist corporate state. It would later collaborate with Vichy France and openly voice support of Germany's occupation of France. Doriot would personally found the LVF, a French unit of the Wehrmacht. He even earned an Iron Cross for fighting on the Eastern Front, for being such a devout Nazi. You literally can't get more obvious than this. A communist who turned to fascism. The neo-socialists who were originally anarcho-syndicalists. All of this points to fascism being a branch off of socialism. That was long. This script took tons of research and a few days to complete. If you haven't been convinced that there is at least some ideological and historical connection between fascism and leftism, then I'm not sure where your brain is at. But still, part 2 is going to be coming out soon, and if you weren't convinced by this video, you will surely be convinced by that one. There, I'll be talking about William Dudley Pelley, and I'll also be talking at length about the mustache man himself. If you like what you saw, and you watched to the end, thank you so much. And tell me in the comments what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it, and please hit subscribe if you want to be notified for part 2. Your support is really helpful. Being a small channel, it's really, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. See you in a little bit.